Hi, I'm JC Raye, and the story I'm going to be reading to you today is called All the Trimmings. It's my story, and it appears in Gravelight Press's new anthology, Exhumed. Professor Norman Tack sat very still inside the oversized tow sack as the little creatures bore him away across the frosty December evening sky, surely bound for what would be a grave, if not unpleasant, incomprehensible fate. While other abductees might have shouted and flailed, or set about ingeniously transforming a stainless steel pen into an improvised weapon in preparation for a daring Hollywood-esque escape, such was not the case with Norman. It was simply not in Norman's makeup to do so. He was a thinker, a theorist, not so much a coward. The details were always such a distraction for the man, always inhibiting any decisive or compelling action on his part. Instead of worrying where they might be taking him or what actually took him, at this moment the professor was genuinely trying to place the pungent odor of the scratchy fabric surrounding him. An endless ride of jolts and jerks in complete and terrifying blackness, the assurance of yet another herniated disc in the near future, while Norman inhaled big whiffs of air, trying to decide between paint varnish or graham crackers. Professor Tack was lovingly referred to both by students and colleagues alike as Tic Tac. He'd inherited the nickname either because of the unmistakable square pale head or the irritating but reliable chatter of boxed breath mints that emanated from the pocket of his tan corduroy jacket on any given day. Presently, he was not even leaning towards the casting of blame, as most would in this scenario. Certainly a dramatic, rather supernatural, and very public kidnapping on a medium-sized college campus like Carroll University might not have occurred if the school grounds had been equipped with adequate lighting, or if a single security officer had been present on the long path back to the West faculty lot. And yes, there were others on the walkway who might have served as more enchanting victims. Several attractive yet unattached co-eds had been milling about, cluelessly texting on their cells, each, no doubt, capable of emitting a blood-curdling scream. There had also been older, tenured, more cadaverous colleagues tottering out to their strategically parked Audis in the furthest regions of the lot. These the creatures might have swept away with ease and conceivably procured a booty of greenbacks and a Rolex in the process. Norman therefore concluded that little Jabbas must have wanted him specifically as they scooped him up and plunked him into their sack. He didn't fuss then, and he wasn't fussing now. Unwisely, perhaps, he was more curious than anything else. Jabbas, Norman's first impression, firing into his gray matter the instant they effortlessly floated down from the foliage in woolly three-piece suits to surround him on the gravel. Indeed, they reminded him of the repulsive alien gangster from the Star Wars mythos. Noggins shaped like slowly melting chocolate kisses, wide slit eyes gleaming golden, which erupted from thick folds of moist amphibian skin. In all honesty, these were far less intimidating than the movie character. Not as one of the creatures rose over 2.5 feet tall. There was also an innocuous sugar plum coloring which made them appear almost doll-like. Well, dolls with the strength of sumo wrestlers who had mastered the power of flight. Hands clasped behind his back, bedecked in velvet, a burgundy dressing gown with a quilted emerald silk collar, Norman turned circles on the tufted rug in front of a crackling fire in the great reading room. As he traveled, he stared down and scowled at the twin idiotic snowman faces crocheted into the slipper socks the Jabbas had bestowed upon him. 7 pairs in all, these the least emasculating. Norman's patience waned. It was a new and altogether disturbing emotion for the 60-year-old humanities lit professor. It seemed to Norman that the Christmas elves, he knew this now, had kept him captive a little bit more than 2 weeks. Certainly the remaining days till the holiday must be few, Norman thought. Yet, to his great dismay, this unspecific supposition was the very limit of how certain he could be about the passage of time during his captivity. Norman was losing track of days. Not at all surprising and completely forgivable when one's surroundings no longer included the customary, recognizable patterns and mechanisms that parceled out a Norman human existence. The rooms he was allowed to see were bereft of clocks and calendars. From what Norman could fathom, his pint-sized captors, beyond numbering in the hundreds, also bore no timepieces, whether wrapped around chubby eggplant wrists or dangling from a fob chained to a cherry-red waistcoat. And though all the rooms featured towering windows, as befitting a Gothic Santa Clausian estate, none were transparent. Norman noted that the windows were not glass, but a type of iron-hard colored ice, which never indicated any change of light outside, whether dawn or dusk. Each window had a unique stained glass depiction that included colorful background details, decorations, lights, and all the trimmings. Strategic shards weaving the glory of Santa, flying the sled over a beaming yellow moon, eating reindeer, descending from a chimney, visiting joyful children in faraway lands. The renderings reminded Norman of the stained glass Stations of the Cross he'd seen portrayed in churches. These creatures, Norman concluded, seemed to have power over ice, snow, and water. He did not really notice it when they appropriated him against his will, too much to take in then. He had assumed they were floating or flying. At closer inspection later, he observed that their power of flight was manufactured by a steady spool of churning ice crystals beneath their feet. Soundless, serving any whim, any speed, and in any direction. The unbreakable windows, many of the door locks, even the fireplace, were a mystifying and fantastic example of this strange technology. The fire looked and acted like fire. It emanated heat, and it dispensed the traditional blend of colors, pops, and sizzles. Yet it was made entirely of ice and therefore required neither a refreshment of logs nor any supervision. Norman assumed that Santa and the elves had avoided detection by utilizing this same unnerving skill. Perhaps this entire estate is safely tucked inside an ice mirage of some kind, he thought. Now, Norman was allowed unlimited access to this space, great reading room, via connecting door to his bedroom. The room, undoubtedly the man cave of old St. Nick, was enormous and rectangular and filled floor to ceiling with bookshelves containing several thousand hardcovers that were inserted into an ocean of shining Italian walnut panels. In the center of each panel, an emblem of holly had been etched. A brightly painted fresco of fir branches adorned the 15-foot high ceiling. Norman felt that it provided the room with a kind of protected feeling, a sense of comfort and warmth, despite the fearsome tempests beyond the walls which howled constantly. At least Norman assumed it was a storm outside and not an incessant chorus of hungry wolves requesting a raw elf dinner. He had no way of knowing. 8 interior columns flanked the long walls. Exquisite carvings of poinsettia garlands were twisted around each other like the stripe on a candy cane The leather chairs were wide and comfortably broken in. Drapes and tiebacks, however, were noticeably absent, perhaps to prevent detainees from inflicting self-harm and hanging themselves. The focal point of this space was the massive fireplace at one end of the vast chamber. Reliefs of toys were hand-carved into the yellow marble. Norman counted 4 dozen in all. Each figure was so personally, beautifully sculpted into the stone that from afar, it seemed the toys might snap to life at any moment and leap down from their station to freedom. The mantel reached well above 12 feet, above which hung a very strange coat of arms that appeared to have been construction of a mixed media rather than metal. A trickle of dried skin hung from the coat, and from this Norman could assume that Santa, in his spare time, was a small game hunter. Everybody's got their vices, mused Norman. Reading was a most powerful distraction from Norman's piteous circumstance. Norman attributed his constant physical pain and the increasing ache in his scalp to be the result of an allergic reaction, or maybe a blossoming infection, caused by either the plucking of all his native sandy brown hair or the expedited 10,000 hair grafts of white llama hair which followed. The elves, it seemed, were unaware of ibuprofen. They did, however, recognize suffering, and they were quick to provide their customary ice packs following any of Norman's many surgeries. Library books were Norman's only means of self-heal. He soon discovered that the library collection was more than just eclectic, it was astonishing. Among the many delightful items on its ledges was a 15th century book of Lismore, a Gutenberg Bible, something by Leonardo da Vinci. Norman almost mistook Leonardo's rose-colored tome for a placemat while looking to set down his daily mug of mulled cider. A colleague at Carroll University had shared with him years ago that only one such copy of that book existed, the original, penned single-handedly by the mathematician himself. Acquired by Bill Gates in the 1990s, Norman had no idea whether any of these books were copies or originals, obtained legally or criminally. For all he knew, Santa was a closet biblioclept. In the early days of this compulsory call, farthest from the fireplace and deep in the shadows, Norman found another section of books. It seemed a mismatch to the others in the great hall, almost at odds with the room itself. These shelves were a disorganized mess, and clearly a signpost of steady activity outside of his peaceful visiting hours. Here books were tipped over on their sides or half pulled away from a ledge. Large piles were stacked haphazardly onto the floor, surrounded by others splayed open with pages bent or torn, looking as if they had been carelessly lopped from several feet away. The professor picked up one of these and scanned its cover. Upon inspection, Norman noticed that these were not bound books, but leather journals with buckle closures, and though many of the straps were missing as a result of their apparent abuse, the brown leather was hard and thick, perhaps buffalo rather than goat or cowhide. The front of the journal contained a rendering of a toy soldier that had been meticulously embossed into the grain. Inside the journal, Norman found step-by-step instructions describing how to make the toy. No words or text, no table of contents, only diagrams and drawings. The last few pages featured color palettes and strokes specific to the painting of eyes, shoes, and uniform. Norman tucked the journal neatly back onto a shelf and then selected one that teetered on its ledge. Norman looked over his shoulder to confirm that he was still alone. uncertain how his little friends might respond to an outsider spying on trade secrets. Then again, Norman reasoned creatures who trim their toenails with their teeth were certainly not bothered by the concept of intellectual property being stolen out from under them. The second journal was much chunkier, spinning tops in tin and wood, and a vast array of painted design samples, everything from cowboys to ballerinas to astronauts to dinosaurs. Other journals he found on higher shelves and coated in dust were those of what Norman assumed to be toy concepts that had lost their popularity, such as a wind-up race car or a wooden horse with wheeled feet. Norman concluded that these journals had been prepared by Santa. He now made a rather exhilarating connection. Norman recalled that several days ago, face deep in Arabian Nights, he heard a breathy exhalation behind him. He looked up to see an elf, rather lanky and with an oversized cranium, just inside the paneled door, observing him quite strangely. Norman had smiled at the creature, nodded, and held his book aloft as if to express his enjoyment of the book. The elf regarded him for a moment more, placed its hands on his hips, shook his head, and left the room. That was it, Norman figured. The Jabbas did not understand the concept of reading. Perhaps Claus quietly suppressed the skill, fearing it would result in reduced productivity. 2 days after they removed his nose and replaced it with that of a crimson-faced Ukari monkey, the combination of itch and throb in Norman's snout could not be satiated by another afternoon of Melville, Tolstoy, or Austen. Norman headed over to the North Wing with a hankering for Yorkshire pudding and maybe a bit of treacle sponge cake. If there were any benefits at all to being slowly torn asunder, body part by body part, and Frankensteined into a Santa Claus, which he now assumed was what was happening, it was the food. A feast was going on any time of day. Not a meal, a feast, the likes of which King Henry Tudor might have drooled over. Trifle, custards, cookies, cake, Duchess potatoes soaked in butter, roasted Brussels sprouts, cranberry and chestnut salad, glazed ham, beef Wellington, roast duckling. Apparently, the elves worked in rotating shifts to ensure that dining hall of Santa's was always set for a scrumptious repast. The creatures also seemed to eat in shifts as well. Day and night, the hall was jammed with their smelly purple selves, elbow to elbow, definitely blabbering away in their slushy, phlegmy, indecipherable mother tongue. Norman usually prepared a tray to take back to his bedroom after spending a good deal of time searching for unmolested portions on the large serving platters, since the creatures were seemingly unaware of silverware or the decorum of chewing with lips zipped. The professor could have eaten 24 hours a day if he fancied. Portion control supervision did not exist. No surprise there, unless they were planning to use a tire inflator on his belly in the last hours before Christmas. As he passed through the connecting hallway with thick timber beams and reindeer portraits, 2 of the Jabbas burst out of the toy shop, which was immediately to his right. One had a chisel handle protruding from his eye socket. His eye gushed purple elf juice all over the damn place. He chased the other with a large red handsaw. Norman literally dove out of their way. Losing his balance, he painfully thumped his funny bone on the corner of Donner's likeness. His presence was unnoticed by the elves. The elf being chased shrieked in fear, and the other, unbelievably still functioning with the business end of a metal chisel driven deeply into his skull, growled like a deranged hound. They soon disappeared down the hall. But now, The toy shop, which Norman had never been allowed to see, was open. Consumed with their Two Stooges cabaret, neither elf had bothered to close or lock the door. It was far too tempting. A deep disappointment, to be sure. Even though his rather lofty expectations of Santa's famous toy shop might very well have been pieced together from childhood memories of Rankin and Bass stop-motion animation, this was a mess. This was wrong. Overturned tables, tools scattered along the floor, spilled paint. Norman treaded carefully to avoid even tripping. Near one of the many spills, a little purple hand had painted a reindeer with 3 heads and a long penis with holly berries growing on it. There were no complete toys to be found at all, only parts in progress, though some of the instructional journals from the library lay about as well. The finger painter seemed to have been at work on these too, penis theme persisting. Someone had painted a crooked checkerboard directly onto a table and used a horde of doll's eyes as the pieces. Several shelves were cramped with rag dials, piled and pushed into each other in 2 and 3. The dolls were missing arms, legs, and they'd been put in disturbing positions. One had been crucified with pencils, a painted tear beneath one of her eyes. At the far end of the room, nails had carefully been driven into the wall in the shape of an elf's face. And it resembled Norman's lanky friend from the library. It appeared as the nail outline was used for a game of file darts. Someone had even thrown an axe. Norman slipped on a paint can and lost his balance. Mid-flight, he caught the vision of a chisel hanging off of a bench seat, fast approaching his face. His decision to attempt an army role came late and failed for several reasons, not the least of which was the fact that Norman knew precious little about actually performing that maneuver. He fell hard, and his shoulder landed directly inside an open box of tacks. A few of them stuck. His first thought was not registering pain, but the fear that he had somehow damaged his nose, and he lifted his hand to check. All good. He then started to remove the little silver thumbtacks embedded in his flesh. He had to use pliers to extract some of them. There was a bit of bleeding. As he did this, Norman spotted another journal just under the table near him. Though not ideal, the loose pages would, Norman determined, be good for blotting blood. It was not a mislaid instructional journal from the library at all, and it was clearly not authored by Santa. Jab a hand. Norman was quite sure it was never meant for his eyes. The first 3/4 of pages were meticulously rendered, vivid colors, exquisite lines, and the illuminated manuscript might have rivaled any medieval monk's sketchbook. It stretched back in the elves' history to a time when Santa first brought them here. The renderings upon the withered pages depicted hundreds of elves chained together and attached to the tail of a very large beast against a landscape that matched their coloring. If the professor had to liken the monster jailer portrayed to any earthly animal, he might settle on a capybara, a South American desert rodent, but one that was over 80 feet long and weighed 300,000 pounds. Clearly, under duress, the elves were churning up the ice under their feet to keep the beast cool. Drawings depicted other beasts, too, scuttling about, skinnier ones, toothier ones, some eating small jabbas, and possibly the elf children. Turning the pages, Norman learned how Santa, under cover of night and in small groups, had chauffeured the elves away through the stars to bring them to his snowy sanctuary. The years that followed looked very happy, with elves being clothed, learning to cook, and blissfully crafting beautiful teddy bears and model trains, while always maintaining a blind deference and passionate admiration for the man who'd rescued them from the rodents. It was here Norman noticed that the pages became dislodged. The leaves were handled, crumpled, stuffed inside. The art became chaotic, shoddy, with a touch of rage. Apparently, Santa had gone through a change. Alzheimer's? Mental illness? Norman could not be sure. Illustrations showed the man wandering off naked into the hills and sometimes breaking toys altogether. Pages and pages of elves being slapped, kicked, pummeled, and as the violence increased, so did the weapons of choice: whips, belts, mallets. A bloody scene laid out like a pornographic centerfold recounting the night Santa murdered all of the reindeer with an auger. Norman did not really need to see the final pages. A helly, holy, unpredictable 'Twas the Night, surefire sequel, in which hundreds of Jabbas finally maxed out on a life of pain over 2 planets, nonetheless. However, like any worthwhile literature professor, he felt compelled to read the story to its end. Norman dropped the journal and raced back to the library, his craving for pudding or other nourishment utterly forgotten. Norman pushed the chair closer to the fireplace. He felt the heat intensify on his knees as he stood atop the chair. Not that it mattered. He needed a closer look. Yes, they'd done it. What he had mistaken for a rabbit or a marten carcass slung over the coat of arms were in fact slices of dried human skin and century-old tangles of light curly hair. They'd killed him. They killed him long ago, and evidently had enjoyed the killing, had taken their time with each ritualistic slice of the vicious tyrant. They had reveled in their newfound freedom and the end to their nightmare. Norman's mind worked quickly to assemble a puzzle forming there, still lacking various pieces. After a time, he deduced that one of the elves, probably the one with the large cranium, must have realized that the world might miss Santa or look for him. Maybe the elves thought everyone on Earth behaved like Santa, and they'd be horribly punished if found out. Maybe they feared the world would send another oppressor to take his place. In any case, Norman concluded that this was why they needed him, and the others, probably others too. Each year, they needed a Santa. For the first time in weeks, Norman felt real fear. He also felt terribly decisive. He hopped down from the chair, resolving for the first time in his life to take compelling action. Of course, taking compelling action is easier said than done when 12 chocolate-kissed creatures topple you to the ground, because that's exactly what they did to him in that moment. When finally they seated him in the wooden sleigh, Norman lacked even an ounce of resistance. Not that it mattered. He was outnumbered 50-1. Norman knew without a doubt that this, his hour of reckoning, was approaching. It seemed as if every resident had put down their figgy pudding pops and red-handled saws to see him off. Many helped load the countless toy sacks onto the sleigh. As the tears streamed down Norman's face, absorbed into the thick white llama beard, only recently sewn into the fleshy part of his cheeks, he moaned horribly and he pleaded for release. Of course, many of his words now were unintelligible due to a current lack of dental fricatives. The elves then showed a translucent rubber mouthpiece slathered with gelatinous sticky glue into his yowling mouth. A wide hole in the rubber enabled him to breathe between his gums. Now Norman understood last night's dental visit, which had resulted in the removal of his teeth, one by excruciating one. His choppers would chatter and break in the cold, and his face would be mercifully pounded by the icy gale. A Santa with a bleeding mouth might be quite a shock for anyone possessing a telescope. Rosy cheeks were expected, not a bloody mouth, not bloody, shattered fangs. While some of the Jabbas snapped Norman's boots into clamps bolted to the slave floor, others belted his body in and pushed his right arm into a special brace. It gave the appearance that Norman was waving forever. As the sleigh launched into the sky, the elves had the audacity to wave goodbye to him. They cheered as if he was a champion, as if they did not expect him to return from his trip an unrecognizable skeleton murdered by their own purpley selves. As he rose, their figures became tinier and tinier. Yet Norman could still see the celebratory dance which broke out in their ardent merriment, a devilish and floating do-si-do. Occasionally, the reindeer, crafted entirely out of hoarfrost, would sharply accelerate upward and climb above the cloud rim. This was most likely done to avoid impact with obstacles. These motions jerked Norman blindly through long and terrifying veils of white. The seat pushed against his back, and his back muscles pushed against the loosely connected organs inside his body. His eyes shut tightly, fully anticipating collision with a flock of geese or the razor-sharp propeller of a helicopter. Perhaps he just waited to hear the piercing snap of the harness break off as he and his jingling red coffin tumbled backward into the night sky. At other times, and again, without warning, the team would plummet downward at a 90-degree angle. Frightening though these dips were, screaming was out of the question, as during this zero-G airtime, Norman had to focus all his energy on remembering to breathe. As the reindeer team straightened out once again, Norman saw the lights of cities below begin to lessen and then disappear altogether. He knew that the vast carpet of blackness which now appeared beneath him was an ocean. Norman heard a rustle behind him, unmistakably a toy sack shifting. And though his body was locked in place, his head was not. It took more than effort to twist his face sideways, and he could hear and feel a cracking on his neck where frost had accumulated already. But now Norman was finally able to identify the source of the sound, and his heart thumped with life anew. The lanky elf had freed himself from a sack and was now clambering over the back of the bench to reach him. Had Norman any tears left to cry, he would have cried them. The elf immediately set to freeing him from his Yuletide bonds. First, he unstrapped the professor's belting and the arm from the bar. It was numb as hell, but there might be a ruthless outbreak of pins and needles to follow, but he still had function of the appendage. Now the elf moved to the floor, broke the locks, which held the boot clamps in place. Once unfettered, the elf freed each foot from its black rubber booty and produced the red wool slipper socks like a magician pulling a dove from the air. He helped Norman slide them onto his feet. The elf bore other surprising gifts as well, such as a warm and wonderful patchwork quilt adorned with fir trees. He placed it around Norman's shoulders He also presented a small thermos steaming with hot mulled cider. After gulping down half the liquid, Norman placed both hands on the elf's shoulders and looked deeply into the creature's eyes and nodded. Norman hoped the elf with the large cranium would understand how grateful he was for having saved his life and the kinship that he now felt for the creature. And when the professor was sure the lanky elf had received the message loud and clear, he let go. The valiant little Jabba assisted Norman in climbing out of the chair and motioned for him to move towards the back of the sacks, perhaps to make more room up front to untie the reins and regain control of the sleigh. Norman's will to take direction from his new hero was fervent, but his body could only navigate sluggishly, muscles sending pain memorandums to the spine. At that moment, Norman felt his entire body being lifted, just under the shoulders, vertically at first, then horizontally at the hands of a gentle purple sumo wrestler, elevated effortlessly as if he wasn't stuffed tight with coconut rum balls and eggnog cheesecake. The archipelago of the Lakshadweep Islands sits 250 miles off the west coast of India. Had Pity Island been inhabited and not been declared a turn sanctuary by the government in the 1960s, perhaps someone might have been lounging on the empty beach and spotted the Santa Claus, who tumbled out of a bank of clouds in the direction of Antarctica. At first, the Santa appeared as a giant red snowflake, butt and belly rotating, arms and legs flailing in all directions. But he quickly modified into more of a shuttlecock, body mass down, picking up speed as he screamed toward the Indian Ocean. To the surprise of the little Jabba with the oversized cranium, Norman did not churn up the ice crystals under his feet to break the fall. So, there it is. Thank you so much for watching. Now, if you like that story and you're saying to yourself, hey, I like that story, where could I find more stories just like that one? Well, that's very easy to do. You need to pick yourself up a copy of the new anthology by Gravelight Press called Exhumed. And also, if you'd like to see more of the disturbing thoughts in my mind, you simply can go to Google and put in J.C. Raye, and my Amazon page will come up. Thank you so much for your time, and I want to thank the publishers very much for this opportunity to be in their amazing new anthology. Thank you.